Could you tell us a little bit about being a child and going to the peace encampment? What you remember?
Well, it was really neat because it was outside, and there was obviously buildings and people were in the buildings a lot, but I remember the buildings as being sort of secondary. It was really, the neat part was just the outdoors, and in the sense that all the adults were sort of playing hooky and doing something, that they were getting a kick out of, and not being at work and doing other dull stuff like that. And there's a sort of neat aspect of community with, I was there with my mother, obviously, so, she was involved in all these things, and I was sort of tagging along, but, it was still, I could see that, she was doing something that was really engaging, and that, that was exciting in a way on its own, even if I didn't really get it fully.
How old were you at that time?
Think about this. I think the first time I came along, it must have been older than 5, but not much. Maybe 7. So.
And so how would you spend your time when you were there?
A lot of exploring outside. I would, spend a lot of time just sort of tagging along with Laura wherever she was going. I remember there were a bunch of old board games in one of the upstairs rooms of the house, and I remember, playing with those, and sometimes ensnaring someone to play with me, and sometimes just sort of reading the instruction cards and, imagining how one would play the game. And I wasn't really a board game person that much anyway, so, that was almost more interesting. So, I do remember exploring the outside and, figuring out how far the trails went, out towards the camping area further back, and, all that stuff. It was neat.
So how old, was there a span of time that your mom would be there, that you would go back? What would be the span in terms of your childhood that you would...
Probably from when I was, 6 or 7. She was going and doing stuff earlier than that, but I would stay home. And then when I was around 10, I wasn't allowed to go anymore. So she continued for a little while to go, but then, then I guess she stopped at some point, so.
Can you explain why you weren't allowed to go anywhere?
I think Laura felt that it would make people uncomfortable because I was a boy, and that, there was some weirdness surrounding that I didn't really understand, but, it was sort of a bummer. I didn't really get it then, and, I understand more now what was going on, but it didn't make a lot of sense then. But I also had other stuff to do, and, I could, but I did miss it.
You did miss it?
I did miss it, and a lot of the people and stuff.
What kind of people?
Well, they're just, to me, as a kid, it was mainly, a bunch of old ladies. Given that, there were people from my mom's age to people who were probably college students at the time to people who were actually, retired and, could be considered old by some stretch of the imagination. But to a 7-year-old, anyone over like 25 is an old person. It's all very relative. But I just remember that the people remembered me. I don't remember there being a lot of other children there at the time that I was there, not very often. Or if there were, they were usually babies or toddlers that you couldn't run around in the woods with, so they were sort of below my radar to some extent, and so it was mainly the adults and people that, people seemed pretty, pretty excited to have children around. I mean, I didn't think of it that way. I just thought everyone was really glad to see me. But I imagine that, to some extent that was, that was probably something that, was hopeful when, even when you're dealing with things like the base sending the helicopters over and stuff. And that was something I remember a lot, was just the low-flying helicopters constantly. And, it's still one of those things that I always sort of I'm startled if I hear a low-flying helicopter, just because it was such a disruptive thing, and I really picked up on how much it weirded out all the adults, and I didn't have any real specific idea of why it was not a good thing to have them around, other than that all the adults were creeped out by them. And, thinking back on it, there is about nothing creepier than having people sending low-flying helicopters to spy on you and intimidate you, and just, it's truly obnoxious. But, at the time, they were sort of neat if you were to subtract away the fact that they were, clearly making everyone else uncomfortable. So, it's
So you were telling us that you thought you were 5, 6, 7 in that age range when you first came to the camp.
Yeah. Is that?
Yeah, that's about right, because he was almost 5 when Arna was born, and we went to the camp for the first time when she was 3 months old. So by the time he was coming, he was 5 or 6.
And do you remember when you first had any inclination of why people were going to this encampment?
Yeah.
Or what it was about?
It was probably closer to 7 by then. It was, when I was a kid, I spent a lot of time listening to the radio, and I'd listen to the news while the adults were cooking and doing whatever for dinner and stuff. And I remember a lot of stuff from the news, and about politics and world events. And I also remember a lot of really bizarre misconceptions I had about those things by listening to it, through the ears of a 5-year-old, and just not getting some things. So.
Do you remember any in particular?
I remember listening to, I remember making the connection that arms and weapons were the same thing, and that so the arms control treaty was not about arms and controlling them, but about whether or not, how large the stockpile of weapons any nation should accumulate. I remember being about 5 or 6 when, when that realization sort of sunk in, and, going back and reevaluating a bunch of news that I had heard, in light of that new discovery. And, it was definitely, definitely a big change in how I perceived things. I mean, stuff like that, just, the adults mainly talking about politics, and, that sort of, what that meant sort of gradually changed over time as I, got more sort of general information about the world from other sources to put it all in context. So it wasn't like there was any one moment where I definitely became fully aware of what everyone was on about, so much as it was sort of a gradual change in perception of that, which, of course, continues for your whole life. So it's hard to say, I can't exactly remember, what my opinion of it was, so much as, just sort of my experience of, being able to tell that the adults were all pretty psyched about this, and so,
So what do you remember about the camp? Do you remember the meetings?
No, I do remember the meetings, but that was not a primary feature of my memory of that. I remember there was a heck of a lot of arguing about who had to keep the minutes. That was that is my primary memory of them, and also, I would largely tune that out, beyond that level, and it was not what I was primarily interested in, so.
Was there ever childcare when you were there?
I probably didn't think of it in those terms. I imagine that the people who did humor me to hang out and play board games in color were actually performing a service that we would call childcare, but I didn't think of it that way. I sort of preferred, being let loose to run around on the trails and in the woods and stuff, but,
Do you remember any interactions with soldiers, like Vince or the depot, or?
I remember hearing a lot about it. I got, I don't remember actually ever being at the fence myself. I mean, I wouldn't rule out that I was there, but, I remember hearing a lot about it, and people were always talking about it. So I didn't, directly, I don't directly remember anything about that, other than that it was, a really mysterious and scary thing that everyone was very fixated on, and, but I don't remember actually being there at any point,
But you spoke about at age 10 when you couldn't be there anymore and not really understanding that. Do you remember any of the times when you were there? Did you ever pick up on any kind of weirdness about you being a boy?
Not really, but then I was not the sort of kid that was really good at picking up on social weirdness. I was often sort of an oblivious type of kid, so I might not have picked up on it, even if it was blatantly obvious to everyone else in the room. I might have been completely off on something else, so it's hard to say.
But you picked up on the weirdness for adults around the helicopters.
Yeah, and that was something that wasn't a social. That was something that was a lot easier. There was sort of a common shared gaze, and it wasn't something unspoken. People would talk about it and be clearly that sort of thing sort of takes a very different form when people are uncomfortable about something that's an other, that's elsewhere, that they can point to, and that's noisy and that isn't gonna it's a very different thing than people being uncomfortable about someone in their midst and not knowing how to address it. That's
Do you remember anything about, like, cars going by or people hollering?
Yeah, I remember that would happen, and I didn't, and there was some degree of eye rolling and just people, I get the sense that, for lack of a better word, that it'd be probably a bunch of rednecks hassling you guys, and I got the impression that people just sort of tried to be patient about it, and sometimes that's unavoidable, but I don't have a real specific memory of any incidents surrounding that, other than that it would happen occasionally and everyone would be sort of exasperated by it, but sort of keep doing what they're doing.
You spoke about all the old ladies that you were hanging out with. Is there anyone in particular that, or an interaction with someone in particular that stands out in your mind?
Not really. I mean, I don't have a lot of really specific imprinted memories. It was some, I guess we went there occasionally and there were like a set of things that were likely to happen and things to do and whatever, and I wasn't really focused on it. I was sort of in the mode of just amusing myself while the adults did their thing, which, you know, most kids have a sort of a way of just sort of doing that, and, you know, so I don't have a lot of, you know, really specific memories. I remember that the outhouses were always a little bit unpleasant and scary because the hole was bigger than I was, and, you know, yeah, but yeah, I don't have a lot of really sharp memories of specific things I was up to, you know, or people I was talking to, or what about, you know. We started having a bunch of meetings and, you know, everything from people talking about that to envelope stuffing to get word out about things in newsletters and stuff at our house in Ithaca, and so, you know, I was somewhat aware of that, and, you know, everyone was very, very scared of it and suspicious of everything from, like, you know, a telephone company truck with, you know, people out on the pole to, you know, everything was just something to be suspicious of, because that's, you know, it's a really scary concept, and so, you know, I didn't really have that much grounds to say whether everyone was just being paranoid or whether that was something that could really happen. I mean, I, you know, at that point was old enough to know that, you know, scientifically, yes, it was possible to do that, whether someone would or could or would put in the effort to do it to you guys, or, you know, what it was, you know, that I didn't have this sort of, I didn't really have an opinion on that, other than that I knew that, you know, it was, what they were allegedly doing was entirely possible and wouldn't be technologically difficult to do. And, you know.
Were you ever frightened by it?
Yeah.
By what they were going through? What?
Yeah, I mean, the stories that people would tell, and again, you know, just the sort of emotional reaction of the adults around me was, you know, that did make an impression. And, you know, I remember a story about one person who got what felt like a sunburn, but they were indoors, and it was, you know, only on the side of them that was facing the base, and that was really, there was a really potent mental image, you know, to, you know, the taking away the illusion that being inside a building gives you any shelter or protection, and by extension, when a radio wave can get in, it can also bounce out, and that takes away any concept of privacy too, because anywhere that you can be reached that way, you can be watched, and that, you know, all of those things together, you know, it's a scary idea. And, you know, I remember that, you know, thinking about that in the context of all these people who were, you know, in my mind, sort of the definition of harmless, and at the same time, you know, it was just a very weird concept to get your head around, and, you know.
Were your experiences, particularly during that time at the camp, were they unusual for the group of friends you had in Ithaca?
I don't think we ever really talked about it in those terms. I mean, my friends were, some of them had parents that were involved in various political things, and to varying extents, and some of them just really didn't. And like I said, it was never really important to us to sort of sort things that way. So I don't really, I don't know. I certainly don't remember that striking anyone as excessively weird, but I don't remember being asked about it either, so.
Mm-hmm. And when you, a little bit earlier when you were talking about sort of your perceptions of the camp, and you sort of said later on you come to understand different things about it. When was that later on, or is it still happening? Or
I'd say it's sort of a continuing process, as anything is, that you experience but don't have complete context on, or even things you experience and sure think you have complete context on, but then you find more out later. I would say that it's a sort of an ongoing thing. I mean, I remember, when I was in, it was probably like 16 and on, I thought about that sort of thing a lot, and I had, more of a broader sense of politically what was up, and I think that I was definitely at that age, very impatient with the concept of consensus-based decision-making, because the school I was attending nominally used that sort of a process, but it was really to, make a lot of decisions, but it was really one of those things where an idea could become popular enough or backed by the right people that it would just sort of get railroaded through, either outside the process or inside the process, where it was just a slow war of attrition where eventually anyone who objected would give up so that we could get on and move on to something else. And that, that's sort of not truly consensus-based decision-making, but that, I was wondering whether, that sort of a model could ever work, and I don't know, I don't remember what the decisions being made were in the meetings that I was around for when I was a kid at the peace camp. It just wasn't, it was outside the scope of what I was, knowledgeable about, or necessarily, had the context to make any meaning out of or be interested in, so.
Do you think that the concept at the peace camp of everyone's getting to say what they thought, having equal value, and everyone being heard, do you think that that was practiced enough in your family that you didn't think that that was an idea peculiar to the peace camp? Or because that was something that you defended ardently in high school, was that for people who followed the process to be heard. But I don't know whether that was something you picked up on as a child or high school.
I don't know where that came from either. I think I've always been inclined to be an argumentative person and a stickler for process. And so if someone writes down a process and then doesn't follow it, it really gets my goat. And so I think that was more where that came from than anything else. If, I think it was just, just more annoyance that they had gone through all that hassle of constructing a system and telling people this is, how it works, and then it didn't work that way. And that was, it's no fair to have to learn all the rules and then not be able to apply them or plot your moves based on applying them, so.
Did you ever go back to the peace camp land after being a kid then?
No, I've gone by it several times, but I've I've never been back. Every time I go by it, I look and see if it looks occupied by anybody, and so far it hasn't. And, I always go by it and I look for that, and I look for the albino deer that are still wandering around inside the base in the absence of hunters and other predators. So.
Do you remember those at all when you were a kid?
Yeah, yeah, and they're sort of neat, and because there were no predators inside the fence, and people weren't allowed to hunt them there, nothing went and ate them, so they stick out like a sore thumb, but they're safe inside that fence, and nothing eats them, so they're just there. And it's sort of interesting because there's a pretty large population of them. I'd say like maybe a quarter of the deer inside the fence are albinos at this point. And also because it's a small population, they're all fenced in, so they can only interbreed with each other. So a weird mutation like that's going to propagate much more, but it's just a very odd sight. Just, I'd never seen an albino deer before in my life, and then there's a whole herd of them. That's sort of unusual, so.
As a kid, though, you remember seeing them?
Yeah.
How did you see them?
Just
encampment, or you mean driving around? Or?
Just on our way past, inside the fence, they'd be like munching on the grass alongside the highway, or, running in the woods, and I remember Laura would point them out and wonder if they're radioactive and stuff like that. And so, they made an impression on me, and I didn't actually think they were radioactive. But at that point, I didn't know that people weren't allowed to hunt in there, and there were no wolves or coyotes in there, and there was no, nothing else to eat them. So I just, it was a weird anomaly that I was able to figure out later why that was, but at the time it was just sort of another odd thing about the immediately surrounding area.
What do you understand now about why women gathered there and what was going on at that time in the world in Seneca Army Depot?
Yeah, I feel like there were a bunch of different things that brought people together that were sometimes related and sometimes unrelated. And I think largely, trying to find some sort of a voice against this sort of building military arsenal, and the feeling that, the United States could just go and start a war somewhere, or, start a war that could conceivably make Earth uninhabitable if the Soviet Union also decided to get into the war. And, I think to a lot of ordinary people that idea that was a real possibility that everyone had to live with was just completely absurd. And yet to the people in the position of power to make that sort of a decision, it didn't seem that absurd at all, or at least they didn't show it. And, even from listening to the radio, I was pretty aware of that. And so the idea of having a place where ordinary people could really, voice their concerns with that, and having it be located next to a place that was not only a symbol of that, being an army base, but a place where, a lot of people still suspect they had stored chemical and biological weapons that were outlawed by the Geneva Convention, but we still had some. It's a really good place to, make yourself heard, and a really, potent symbol of why that, why it doesn't make sense to have these weapons and to store them anywhere. And that was sort of one aspect that I was aware of. And then there was, an aspect that I, understood less of about it being, primarily or only for women and children, which, that's one that also has to be taken more in its cultural context and time. I think that, at the time it was there was this association between men and violence, both with war and at home, that was hard, that for a lot of people was hard to peel away from the whole thing, and for a lot of people that may, were definitely, against war, but may have been seeking refuge from violence at home, not violence in society. But if all those things sort of were rolled together, it served more functions than just protesting the war itself, and also, protesting traditionally. Most truly effective protests against war have been made not by men but by women and children, because one can always say that men are protesting against the war in their own interest because they don't want to go to war. Whereas traditionally, when we don't send women and children into battle, that's a very different, it's a much more powerful statement, because you can't make that argument of this person is just directly in self-interest, doesn't want to get blown up, so I think there's something that makes the message more believable. But I don't know, that was just sort of occurred to me as an additional factor and may not actually have anything to do with it. So
Just right now you came up?
yeah, I haven't really verbalized any of these things or thought about, I don't think verbally, so a lot of this stuff is just stuff that's been floating around in, a conceptual structure in my head, but hasn't really been put into words before, which probably should have thought about that,
That's great.
Yeah.
Do you identify with feminism?
I don't know. That's sort of been an ongoing,
You have a comment to add to that, Kate?
Nothing, not really. When Lars and I first met, he was very hostile to the concept of feminism, which I found interesting because he was, through his actions, one of the most ardent feminists I'd ever met. He just, wouldn't discuss it, didn't want to go into the, that as an approach to literary criticism, that as a way to understand the political situation, that as a way to understand any aspect of day-to-day life was just, we're not going there. That's complete BS. No.
I was interested to hear Lars talk about the women at the peace camp as just everyday, regular people, because the group of women at the peace camp were, for the most part, lesbians and radically different than the rest of society. And if you saw peace camp women walking down the street, except maybe in a college town, it wouldn't be so noticeable. You wouldn't think of them as everyday people, at least not in the reality I live in now. But that Lars just thought the peace camp women were everyday people coming together to do this work is kind of neat. Did you want to comment on that? Did you notice anything odd about the women at the camp?
Not at the time. Yeah, when I, as a kid, no. And later on, as I was growing up, I, realized that, these are not statistically an average sample of the population of this country, but in terms of being people with just basic motivations that people have and everything, it's, there's nothing unusual really now. So I guess, again, I think this is also something in, that in cultural context, things have changed even in my lifetime so far. I guess I tend to hold sort of more of an egalitarian belief where everyone is, of equal worth as a person, whatever they're on about, whatever they're up to. And so long as you're not going around stomping on other people's dreams, you should be left alone to do your own thing. And that, and that sort of, if you really think about it, that should be, in theory, empowering to everyone to just be themselves. And, I'm fond of that because it avoids making generalizations or attaching personality traits, characteristics, or values implicitly to either gender, and it avoids compartmentalizing people and pigeonholing them and lumping together all sorts of different values and goals and stuff, and trying to tag someone into a category with some pre-assigned set of values and goals. And I guess my experience, is that people, of previous generations that were really, intensely into feminism were very uncomfortable with men, and, but for specific reasons and due to, specific circumstances. But I felt, being younger and not having been around for the formation of those opinions, it was difficult to know that someone was uncomfortable with my presence or existence or values or perceived values was the real kicker, for, on account of the actions of people who had made those actions before I was born, or, or on, just in general, on account of the actions of others, that, that's obnoxious. And, I similarly think that, I think that a lot of approaches to life and that allow for sort of categorizing anyone else as other, fall into that same pitfall where you will run across an individual who has not done any specific harm or knowingly transgressed against your happiness or values or freedom or anything, and you're going, as soon as you start categorizing anyone as other, you're going to write someone off who hasn't meant or done any harm, or at least you run that risk. And so I try really hard. I mean, obviously I'm human and don't always succeed, but I try really hard to do that as little as possible and to be as conscious of when I'm tempted to say, you know what, that person I don't get it. They can go over there. I don't care what they do. So, I try to avoid doing that, and I think a lot of that hostility that I was working out when Kate and I met was that the people were still talking in terms of labeling someone as other, and a lot of people, especially people I went to high school with, didn't see that they were doing that, or because they're labeling someone else than who was traditionally labeled as other, they thought it was a great chance to turn the tables and didn't see that by doing exactly what they were protesting against, it was not helping. And so that was sort of where that came from, I think.
I'm curious if you can attribute, in terms of who you are today and when you interact with peers, if there's anything about you that might have a river that runs from your time at the encampment, or what you knew about those times that sets you, I don't know, not apart, but gives you a certain sensibility that people your age don't have.
I don't know if it would be like any specific trait or characteristic that would be traceable. I don't find myself like referring back to some formative experience and, whatever, but I think that just being, socialized around a lot of adults as a kid probably helped. I mean, people frequently think I'm older than I am, which, it used to be a blessing and will one day be a curse, and right now is neutral. So, I think that just, having that much of an early start on, hearing adults talking about, what was important to them and what they're up to and everything was probably as much that as anything. And, the fact that they were fairly open and frank and we're not afraid to argue about it, but we're not arguing. They were arguing with opinions, not against each other as people, so that, you got a lot of varied opinions. And even, just being exposed to that, I'm sure was, stimulating for the brain and all that. So